Hello everyone, Awataru here. Today I will be introducing the ancient Chinese philosophical text, Lao Tzu. If you are wondering what kind of work it is, it's a classic masterpiece that advocates casting aside unnecessary desires and knowledge to live life exactly as it is. It is a book I highly recommend picking up, especially if you are in a management position, struggling with not getting the results or recognition you expect, wanting to sharpen your flexible thinking, constantly worrying about your own flaws and weaknesses, or searching for a way to live comfortably without pushing yourself too hard. In contrast to the Analects, Lao Tzu carries a pastoral and somewhat laid-back atmosphere. However, this book is neither a mere guidebook for hermits nor a practical manual that can be easily understood. It approaches the origin of all things from a natural science perspective, and upon that foundation lays out survival skills for a fiercely competitive society and a governing theory to unify an endlessly conflicted world. It is an incredibly dynamic philosophical work, that is, Lao Tzu. In this video, I will introduce this massively scaled work in an easy-to-understand way, weaving in its historical background. You do not need any prior knowledge to watch, so please grab a cup of tea, relax, and stick around until the very end. Well then, let's get started. Lao Tzu. First, let me give you an overview of this video. I will start with a brief introduction to the figure of Lao Tzu as background knowledge, and then dive into the contents of the book through three main themes: those who follow the way and those who stray from the way, the most ideal leader, and a way of life like water. Let's start by taking a look at the background information. There are many unknown details regarding the birth and life of Lao Tzu, but according to one theory, he is said to have worked as an archivist, managing books at the Central Court of Ancient China around the 5th century BC, spanning the end of the Spring and Autumn period and the beginning of the Warring States period. At one point, realizing the decline of the Central Court, Lao Tzu abandoned his country and his work, mounted an ox, and set out on a journey to the west. When he arrived at a border pass known as the Hangu Pass, the official in charge, a man named Yingxi, appeared and said to him, "Please share your thoughts on morality, life, and the ideal state of society." In response, Lao Tzu remained at the pass for a while and wrote the Tao Te Ching, a manuscript consisting of 2 parts and over 5,000 characters. This philosophical text was later given the title Lao Tzu, after his own name, and became widely known throughout the world. Now, as we prepare to read this book, I would like to clarify a few key terms. The first is the concept known as Tao, Tao. Lao Tzu posited that before all things in the universe existed, there was an entity that could be called the Mother of Heaven and Earth, and he named this the Tao. Confucius, the founder of Confucianism, also taught about the Tao, but his concept is completely different from what Lao Tzu describes. While the former is essentially a practical morality that emphasizes rules, discipline, and propriety, the Tao preached by Lao Tzu refers to a transcendent reality that cannot be perceived by the 5 human senses. It is an absolute entity that can neither be given a physical form nor expressed in words, representing the fundamental underlying principle and order itself that existed prior to the universe and all of creation. Building upon this, Lao Tzu believed that living in accordance with the Tao, the way, was the ideal way of life for humanity. However, being told to follow such an abstract and difficult concept leaves us honestly unsure of what exactly to do. Therefore, Lao Tzu succinctly expressed the basic stance for living in accordance with the Tao through a specific phrase. This is the second keyword, Wu Wei Ziran, non-action and naturalness. Wu Wei Ziran means not trying to forcefully manipulate things, but rather leaving them as they are and allowing them to take their natural course. Wu Wei, non-action, does not mean doing absolutely nothing, but rather abstaining from artificial or contrived actions. Meanwhile, Ziran, naturalness, does not refer to elements of nature like mountains and rivers. It means so of itself, signifying a state free from any external influence. Take, for example, the changing of the seasons, the flow of rivers, the ebb and flow of the tides, and the movement of celestial bodies like the sun and the moon. These are not artificially controlled, but are instead governed by the laws of nature. In the same way, because we humans are a part of nature and are destined to be subject to its guidance, he believed it was important to live as we are, without contrived actions. At the time, Chinese society was fundamentally based on the teachings of Confucianism, maintaining social order through moral education that emphasized etiquette, manners, and compassion for others. However, Lao Tzu argued that people should instead follow the Tao, the absolute order, because such contrived family structures and ritualistic culture turn people into hypocrites and lead to moral corruption. Furthermore, because Confucianism was premised on a strict class system and hierarchical relationships, it appears to have been psychologically oppressive for those who could not conform to it or those in socially vulnerable positions. Therefore, Lao Tzu's philosophy developed as a spiritual refuge for those who were completely exhausted by the formal teachings of Confucianism and the society built around them. That being said, if all artificial constructs are rejected, it becomes difficult to build a civilization or stabilize society, which does not seem very realistic. So, what exactly was the ideal society according to Lao Tzu? That brings us to the third key word: a small state with few people. A small state with few people refers to the utopia advocated by Lao Tzu, meaning a small nation with a small population. At the time, China was in a turbulent era, so a massive nation with a large population, vast territory, and high productive and military capabilities was considered the ideal. Under such circumstances, Lao Tzu argued that the size of a state should be kept compact. The tools used by humans should be limited to the bare minimum, and even interactions between regions should be avoided. Excessive property, excessive tools, excessive information, and excessive interaction with others. He believed that the existence of these things unnecessarily stimulates human desires, making people dissatisfied with their own lives and culture, and thus prompting them to start unnecessary conflicts. He reasoned that if a small community were created to eliminate these elements, allowing people to live modestly and spiritually rich lives without unnecessary stimulation, a conflict-free utopia would emerge. However, according to one theory, the small state Lao Tzu spoke of referred to a small village community, and it is said that he intended to build an ideal large nation by bringing these communities together. He lived in an era where war was a daily occurrence, and most people could not live out their natural lifespans. It is precisely because of this background that Lao Tzu idealized a society where human beings could survive to the very end without conflict, and he championed the concept of a small country with few people as an idea to achieve this. Incidentally, the great Russian author Tolstoy was influenced by Lao Tzu's philosophy of peace and advocated for non-resistance and non-violent movements, which were later inherited by Gandhi, the father of Indian independence. In other words, if you trace the currents of the nonviolent civil disobedience movement, you actually arrive at Lao Tzu as the point of origin. Now that concludes the background knowledge. Is everything clear so far? Let us finally move on to the main section. The first theme is those who follow the Tao and those who stray from the Tao. Let's begin. A Tao that can be explained as the Tao is not the true Tao. A name that can be called a name is not the true name. The Tao originally had no name, but it is the very source of all things. From it, heaven and earth arose, and all creations were born. All right, I will pause here. The passage explained that the Tao is the root of all things, and it is originally nameless and not something that can be easily described. Therefore, you do not need to clearly understand exactly what the Tao is at this current stage. I just want you to roughly envision it as a universal entity or a fundamental principle that exists at the source of all things in the universe and governs them. Now, let's listen to the continuation. Those who follow the Tao simply accomplish their purpose. Once their purpose is fulfilled, they do not resort to any further unnecessary force. Once their purpose is fulfilled, they do not boast about their talents, brag, or show off their strength. Indeed, it has been said that those who follow the way simply fulfill their purpose. Even after achieving a certain goal, human beings often remain unsatisfied, seeking further results or praise, and unintentionally end up pushing themselves too hard. Lao Tzu, however, believed that such excessive effort strays from the way and can ultimately lead to one's downfall. Looking back at history, there are countless examples of individuals who, after achieving more than enough social success, tried to aim even higher, only to ruin their health or fall from grace due to the resentment of others. Other classical Chinese texts also contain similar lessons. For instance, the Analects states, "Going too far is as bad as not going far enough," cautioning that overdoing something or taking it to extremes is just as harmful as falling short. The military treatise by Sun Tzu also contains the maxim, "When surrounding an army, leave an outlet free." This teaches that when besieging an enemy, you should not completely cut off their retreat, but always leave them a path to escape. After all, what is the true purpose of waging war? It is not to annihilate the enemy, but to secure a peace agreement that is advantageous to your own country. Nevertheless, if you forget this purpose, block the enemy's escape route, and corner them completely, you will face unexpected resistance. Even if you win, the risk of suffering unnecessary casualties and exhaustion increases significantly. Therefore, once your primary objective has been achieved, rather than giving in to greed and trying to acquire even more, you must take a moment to step back and ask yourself if there is truly a justifiable cause to push any further. Lao Tzu rejected desires that strayed from the way, but he was especially critical of an arrogant attitude driven by blatant self-display, leaving behind the following words. "Those who stand on tiptoe to make themselves look larger cannot stand for long, and those who take large strides in a rush to hurry forward cannot go far." Similarly, those who praise their own actions will instead be alienated by the world. Those who insist they are right will instead fail to be recognized as such, and those who are overconfident in their own talents will instead not endure. Yes, let's stop here. People often exert unnecessary effort, trying to make themselves appear greater than their actual abilities, but Lao Tzu criticized such superficial behavior, referring to it as excess food and superfluous action. This phrase describes an extravagant meal that was overprepared and went to waste. In other words, it signifies useless actions. The desire for wealth, high status, and honor, this kind of urge for self-display can sometimes serve as the energy that drives personal growth. However, Lao Tzu argued that using such desires as a driving force will not lead to success, and even if it does, it certainly will not last. He ruthlessly discarded the desire for self-display as useless excess weight. Furthermore, he considered even learning and knowledge to be unnecessary, leaving behind the famous saying, "Renounce learning, and your sorrows will end." He believed that if we could cast aside unnecessary knowledge, our unnecessary worries would disappear, allowing humans to reclaim their original, natural way of life. While it is certainly better to have knowledge, having more of it is not necessarily always preferable. It is quite common for people to become too afraid to act because they possess an excess of knowledge, or to miss a critical opportunity because they overthink things. Since the modern era is particularly prone to information overload, making it easier to accumulate anxiety and stress, there are likely many who find themselves struck by Lao Tzu's philosophy. Furthermore, He considered not only the tools of civilization and academic learning to be unnecessary, but also military force and political power, proposing a new method of governance known as the rule of non-action. He asserted that by thoroughly stripping away all excess, the world would naturally govern itself. One might think this sounds quite extreme at this point, but what exactly was his underlying aim? Well then, I would like to move on to our second theme, the most ideal leader. Let's dive in. If the wise are not revered, the people will not contend. If wealth is not prized, the people will not steal. Moreover, if they are not shown things that provoke desire, the minds of the people will not be disturbed. Therefore, when a sage governs a state, it is by making the people ignorant and free of desires. Okay, let's pause here. What I just introduced is a passage that bluntly demonstrates Lao Tzu's political ideology. In essence, if the person at the top only praises certain individuals or glorifies specific things, the public will fight to attain them, so a fixed set of values must not be established. On top of that, he argues that one should strive to keep the masses ignorant and desireless so that malicious cunning does not come into play. This perspective of Lao Tzu's can be interpreted as an obscurantist policy aimed at keeping the public foolish. However, it also seems intended to rebuild a peaceful, conflict-free nation by returning humans to their original state of being ignorant and without desires. Yet, if the people truly become ignorant and desireless, the country falls entirely to the whims of its rulers, potentially risking even greater chaos in society. So what did Lao Tzu think about this? He actually left behind this phrase, "Governing a large state is like cooking a small fish." This means that when ruling a massive nation, one should treat it just as carefully as one would when boiling a small fish. In short, when cooking small fish, if you clumsily stir or poke them, they will fall apart and become inedible. Similarly, in national politics, if those at the top interfere too much, the public will instead become confused, and things will not go well. As terms like micromanagement and overprotection suggest, whether in the workplace or in education, it is common for things to take a turn for the worse, such as hindering a person's growth or damaging relationships, simply because someone in a superior position meddled unnecessarily. Building upon this, Lao Tzu continues as follows. There are those who set their minds on conquering the world and take contrived actions, but such desires will never be fulfilled. This is because the world is a sacred vessel, and no matter how much one schemes, it cannot be forced to their will. Those who act to shape it will instead destroy it, and those who try to grasp it will instead lose it. Okay, let's pause here. In other words, because the people are a sacred vessel rich in diversity, treating them artificially will cause them to break. The core message is that rulers should ultimately aspire to govern through non-action, Wu Wei, in accordance with the Tao. However, what we must be careful to note here is that the governance of non-action preached by Lao Tzu neither denies the value of a leader's existence, nor does it represent mere laissez-faire policy. Rather, he promotes a gentle form of governance where, by the leader remaining unobtrusive, the autonomy of each individual is naturally activated. Furthermore, Lao Tzu describes the ideal leader as follows. The more prohibitions there are in the world, the poorer the people become. The more weapons there are, the more chaotic the nation grows. And the more cunning skills people possess, the more sinister things are created. Therefore, the sage says, if I do nothing, the people will naturally govern themselves. If I do not instigate things, the people will naturally prosper. If I am free of desires, the people will naturally remain simple and pure. The most ideal leader is one whose subordinates are barely aware of their existence. Next is a leader who is loved and admired by their subordinates, followed by a leader who is feared, and the worst is a leader who is mocked by their subordinates. If a leader demonstrates a calm demeanor and refrains from saying unnecessary things, work will go smoothly, and the people will say, we did it ourselves. All right, let's pause here. It was mentioned that the most ideal leader is one who is unnoticed by their subordinates. You might worry if such a person is truly fit to be a leader, but being unnoticed by subordinates certainly does not mean doing nothing. In short, it is someone who bestows benefits and prevents trouble behind the scenes without basking in praise, seeking gratitude, or standing out, yet always remaining entirely composed. That is precisely the kind of sage who is worthy of governing the world. Those in power often eliminate or coerce those who do not obey them, but Lao Tzu believed that the true nature of the Tao is to accept human diversity and respect autonomy. Furthermore, he spoke as follows about the trap of desire that people in power often fall into. It is better to stop trying to constantly fill everything to the brim, like pouring water into a vessel. If you try to sharpen a blade to its absolute limit, it will actually become more prone to breaking. In the same way, the more your wealth increases, the more your worries will increase because you must protect it, and the more you obsess over status and prestige, the more you will bring about your own ruin. Therefore, if you believe you have accomplished your work, step down immediately. That is the way of heaven. All right, let's pause here. Regardless of the field, becoming famous or reaching a high position is extremely difficult. Some people have likely acquired their status by sacrificing what is important to them, such as their family, friends, and health, putting their very lives on the line. Therefore, it is perhaps natural in a sense that they do not want to give up the position they finally obtained through such immense effort, wishing to hold on to it for as long as possible. However, if they endlessly overstay their welcome without setting a clear time to step down, it has been a common occurrence since ancient times for them to incur the resentment of the next generation or make unexpected blunders. Even today, there are countless examples of prominent figures, such as business executives and politicians, causing scandals and tarnishing their later years to the point of ruining their hard-earned achievements. For this reason, Lao Tzu believed that once you have achieved success and fame, you should gracefully step aside rather than clinging to power and insisting you can still keep going. So why is it that humans, despite learning these lessons from history, so often fail to recognize when to step away? The reasons include succumbing to the desire to not let go of what they have once acquired, as well as the difficulty of evaluating themselves objectively. One's abilities, physical stamina, mental fortitude, appearance, way of speaking, and attitude. It is quite difficult to realize for yourself how much these elements have changed compared to the past, how they are perceived by the people and environment around you, and what kind of impact they are having. This is especially true as one's position, age, or power increases, because people around them become increasingly cautious and hold back honest feedback. As a result, it is not uncommon for people in power to mistakenly judge that they are still highly capable, remaining active in their positions until they cause some sort of problem and ultimately fall from grace. In light of this, Lao Tzu describes the traits of a truly exceptional person as follows. Those who understand others are exceptional individuals, but those who understand themselves are even more exceptional. Furthermore, those who overcome others possess strength, but those who overcome themselves are truly powerful individuals. He who knows that enough is truly wealthy. He who perseveres has already achieved his goals. He who does not lose his true self will endure. Since gaining and losing are two sides of the same coin, the more you acquire, the more you stand to lose. So, what is the most important thing for a human being? It is one's own life. As long as you have your life, you should be fully satisfied. If you live with this mindset, you can enjoy this world for a long time. All right, let's pause here. It seems Lao Tzu highly valued those who could view themselves objectively and maintain their true selves without being controlled by their desires. When our desires are fulfilled, we humans are temporarily satisfied. However, after a while, we want to experience that feeling again. In fact, we become driven by even stronger desires, wanting to attain something even greater and immerse ourselves in an even better feeling. Therefore, to help us break free from this endless loop of desire, Lao Tzu introduced the famous concept of knowing when enough is enough. In other words, rather than trying to completely satisfy our endless desires, we should recognize when we have exactly what we need and decide that it is enough. The idea is to live happily, fully content with our current lives and who we are right now. However, because we live in a modern consumer society that constantly stimulates our desires, the problem is that it has become difficult to grasp what we truly want and what our personal enough actually looks like. Because of this, it might be necessary to occasionally disconnect from external stimuli and take the time to deeply reflect on our current desires and the underlying emotions behind them. That being said, some of you might be wondering if it is truly possible to survive in this harsh reality by living like a hermit. So, in the next part, we will overturn this fragile image of Lao Tzu and explore his philosophy of water, which is celebrated as being both the weakest and the strongest. With all of that in mind, let's move on to our third theme, living like water. Let's get started. Furthermore, Lao Tzu believed that we should learn humility from the nature of water and left behind the following words. The great ocean can be the king of hundreds of rivers because it positions itself lower than any of them. In other words, he thought that the ocean, which humbly accepts water at the lowest point without discrimination, whether it comes from a muddy river or any other source, represents the ideal form of a great nation and the kind of ruler one should strive to be. Moreover, not only Lao Tzu but also Sun Tzu focused on the appearance and characteristics of water to discover the ideal state of an army. Water has no fixed shape. It can flexibly change its form depending on its surrounding environment, just as it becomes square when poured into a square container and round when poured into a round one. Similarly, if an army's formation lacks a fixed pattern, the enemy will be unable to grasp its true nature, making it extremely difficult to attack. As a result, it becomes possible to build a highly defensive organization. In addition to this, attacking in an ever-changing fluid manner like water can confuse the opponent, and exploiting those openings creates a chance for victory. In short, the philosophy of water is also a practical philosophy for navigating the world that can be applied to all situations in life, including business and personal matters. Building upon this, Lao Tzu associated the soft, fragile nature of water with life and presented his unique view on life and death as follows. Human beings are soft and supple while alive, but once life is lost, they become stiff and rigid. The same applies to all things in nature, such as grass and trees. While alive, they are soft and fragile, but when they die, they wither and harden. In other words, to be hard and strong is to be a companion of death, while to be soft and weak is to be a companion of life. Yes, I will stop here. All animals and plants are soft while alive because they contain moisture, but when they die, their ability to retain water drops and they stiffen. Lao Tzu focused on these natural phenomena, contrasting attachment and rigidity with life and death. Incidentally, water is said to make up about 60% of an adult's body weight and 70% to 80% of a baby's. Therefore, boiling down this philosophy of water, it seems that a baby, which contains a high percentage of water and has no unnecessary attachments, might be the closest to the ideal human being. And Lao Tzu's answer is that this is exactly the case. In other words, despite being a soft and weak existence, a baby is not attacked by anyone, and despite being innocent and devoid of greed, vitality overflows from its entire body. He considered the figure of such a baby to be the ideal human form living in accordance with the Tao. However, if living exactly as you are in a completely pure state like a baby is the ideal, It might seem advantageous for those naturally endowed with exceptional talent, but disadvantageous for those who are not. Recently, in particular, there is a strong prevailing argument that a person's life is determined by their innate appearance, abilities, and family environment. And it is said that many people are unable to accept themselves as they are. However, Lao Tzu did not consider possessing talent to be something to simply rejoice about. This is because innate talent can actually bring suffering upon oneself, just as tigers and leopards are targeted by hunters for their beautiful fur, or how monkeys and hounds are captured by humans and lose their freedom due to their agility and intelligence. When looking around at human society, it is a common sight to see highly talented individuals being crushed by the jealousy of those around them, or becoming isolated and misunderstood by everyone. Society's common sense, norms, and standards of evaluation. Depending on your perspective or the timing, these can be utter nonsense, and they are certainly not absolute conditions that guarantee human happiness. Furthermore, a life that others perceive as happy is entirely different from a life that you yourself feel is happy. If that is the case, one begins to wonder how much meaning there truly is in obsessing over a single thing or standard, being unnecessarily vain or jealous, or trying to acquire something even at the sacrifice of your health. At the same time, a sense of hope emerges. The hope that past failures and misfortunes, as well as any current feelings of inferiority, might all be flipped into positives depending on how you choose to look at them. For better or worse, Lao Tzu's philosophy deviates from conventional wisdom, so it may be quite difficult for people today to practice it exactly as it is. However, his incredibly flexible, water-like approach to perceiving things is an especially effective mindset for our rapidly changing times. If this video has sparked your interest, why not pick up a copy and read it for yourself? Well, that wraps up our look at Lao Tzu. What did you think? The work itself is not very long, but the content is truly profound and open to a variety of interpretations. Because of this, I hope you treat this video as merely a point of reference and take the time to actually read the book yourself. I will also leave a link to the book and related videos in the description box, so please check them out if you are interested. If you found this video interesting or helpful, I would really appreciate it if you could leave a like and a comment. Also, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.